Hello and welcome to a very special Rangers Review evening briefing with myself, Jonny McFarlane, and I'm joined by Martyn Ramsay. Martyn, welcome to the show.
Good evening, Johnny. Thanks for having me, as always.
It's always a delight, mate. Listen, we had a really good conversation on the launch of your first book, Revolution, and I'm delighted to say you've agreed to come back to discuss The Pursuit of History, the much-awaited second chapter. Now, guys, before I get started into the questions that I've got for Martyn, and listen, I was just saying off air that we could talk about this book probably for hours and hours on end, because this is square in both of our wheelhouse in terms of when we grew up and the time frame. But before we start, the book's obviously a brilliant Christmas gift. If you want to get your hands on a copy, heartandhand.co.uk. You can get signed copy of the book. You can get it as part of a double pack with Revolution. And really, if you've not read the first part, you want to read both, because this is the definitive history from 1986 to 1998. And if there was a period of time where you would really want to wallow in Rangers history, this is it, folks. Younger viewers, trust me, you're going to enjoy it. So I think if you want to get it on there, Martyn, you're prepared to do a special message, is that right, on these purchases through Heart and Hand?
Yeah, I mean, if you want just this book, then you'll get it signed, no problem. There's a special deal, as you said, Johnny, for both this and Revolution, cheaper than you'll get them anywhere else. Obviously, I'll sign both, but if they're for a gift this Christmas, as I imagine a lot of them will be, I'm happy to write a kind of bespoke message in there. So when you order it, I'll email you and ask what that message may be, and get that in and off. And you can get it on Amazon as well if you prefer to give Jeff Bezos your money instead of taking food out my unborn daughter's mouth. But if you like Kindle, which I appreciate a lot of people do, then of course they're available right now.
Yeah, that link, guys, is in the description for the video. So if you want to go on there and buy a copy, as I say, it's a fantastic, fantastic book. I finished reading it last night. I've been beavering away, as everyone knows, because I moan about it all the time. I've got a young child who takes up a lot of my time when I'm not on work. So it's hard for me to get through a book nowadays. Martyn, as you're about to find out. But I think anyone who splashes out is going to be very happy with it. And if you give them that as a gift for the Rangers fan in your life, and I'm sure there's plenty in your family, then I'm sure they will love it too. Right, let's get on to the questions. I've got so much to talk to you about, Martyn. I'm going to start with maybe a slightly tough one. Having read through Revolution, I was away in Portugal, as you know. Read that book as well, and now this book in the last couple of weeks. I think it's fair to say part of the first book, there was a kind of almost a reappraisal and credit where credit's due given to David Holmes. In the first part of the book, he almost comes out as the unsung hero of the Rangers Revolution. And I wonder, reading this book, who in your view would be the unsung hero of The Pursuit of History, the 92 to 98 period? Is there someone that stands out in the way David Holmes did, that while you were going through your research and looking at this period, that you thought that person was pivotal and perhaps hasn't had the credit that they deserved?
It's a difficult one, Johnny, because it's such a celebrated era, and just about every player could do their own live show, VIP, £100 a ticket kind of night, because they're part of an immortal team in an immortal era. So there are very few figures that I think go without praise. Certainly off the pitch, I think what Revolution tried to do was not cast David Murray in a new light necessarily, but there was, I think, an acceptance that the David Holmes stewardship and early David Murray, with reality matching ambition and dynamism and pace, is your ideal. The Rangers board that came before 1986 was absolutely not. It was so officious and bogged down by bureaucracy and lack of investment and whatever else, and ideas and vision, and we kind of captured from 86 to 92 that kind of perfect moment. There were seeds, and we kind of finished Revolution with those seeds of doubt and those seeds of, well, let's be honest, disaster sown with the lack of corporate governance, and Murray maybe looking towards Bernard Tapie or Berlusconi as being, club owners who are almost as famous as the managers or players, and very much tied to that star. And that's clearly where David Murray's story kind of develops. And there's, as we know, I think with David Murray's legacy and reputation is now, there's more development in that. But it's a difficult one to square because people were contemporaneously lapping it all up, the success after success, but trying to put that in its context. If you want an unsung hero off the field and on, Campbell Ogilvie maybe is the kind of character that I've seen a lot of people in the review of this book saying maybe isn't around at Ibrox anymore. Again, vision and contacts and presence in the world game, and look what he changed. Now, by his own admission, that's not what he tried to change, and it didn't try to create the Champions League as we would know it, but he did, and Rangers were at the forefront of that, just as this book picks up. And that kind of figure off the field probably doesn't get the recognition he deserves, because he, again, like Holmes, didn't seek the limelight. Just was happy to kind of get on with his role. On the pitch, a reappraisal for me of Stuart McCall actually was a player I didn't particularly have a lot. How could you when you're growing up with all these almost mega stars? And he's involved in so much of what Rangers did well and quite consistently. So with so many spotlights throughout that era, maybe shine that one a wee bit brighter for those two.
Yeah, I suppose the one thing about Campbell Ogilvie that, if you're talking about in today's context, a great conciliator, someone who could charm and work the corridors of power of Scottish football. And you saw that when he ascended the Scottish game. And I think perhaps one of the things that when Martyn Ramsay of the future comes to write Rangers 2012 to 2022, they might say that that's something that's been ultimately lacking. Someone, a conciliatory figure to bring the rest of Scottish football on board, while a very strong Celtic board is able to adopt that stance that I think Murray and Ogilvie together, they had a pretty good, pretty effective yin and yang in terms of getting control of the major institutions, and people totally undervalue that.
Oh, completely. It's a political force, and he, by his own admission, had to wear different hats at different times, and he needed to be a conciliator in the revolution era, because how can we put this? Graham Souness wasn't, and he wasn't that type of presence, and he looked on the Scottish game with a lot of disdain, really, especially the administrators. His time as a Scotland player, he always felt they got the best hotels and flights ahead of the players, and they were just a bit fit to run a bowling club, let alone a National Football Association. A wee bit to that same degree, I suppose, in this era, this group. I guess the one thing that would frustrate him is that a lot of Scottish clubs, Rangers, Aberdeen, Hearts, Hibs, in particular, wanted to break away a lot quicker than the SPL eventually did. And it was all so often got close, and then it was, Celtic most notably pulling out around 93, I think, from memory, with a lot of other context around the Taylor Report and needing Hampden and everything else. But if Scottish football is ever going to make this breakaway at the right point, then maybe 92, to be honest, was 92, 93 around. It's probably even too late, but 98 certainly was. The boat was missed in terms of, Sky was still interested, and it was still Scottish football still having a place there before the Premier League was born, and it kind of took off. If we'd have managed somehow to package and market and reorganize ourselves a lot sooner, perhaps those coattails could have been ridden for a lot longer in a lot better way. So I'm pretty sure that'd be something a frustration that Campbell Ogilvie would share, because they couldn't quite get that over the line as soon as they needed to.
And listen, as evidence of that, you only have to look at the commentary teams, and you quote this in the book in terms of who was on: Martin Tyler and Andy Gray. That is the equivalent of I forget the name of the guy who's the chief commentator now that Tyler's been taken over.
Peter Drury.
Peter Drury, yeah, and Gary Neville, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the top two at the time. So that shows you the value that Sky put on that product at the time. There's absolutely no way Gary Neville would be coming up for a Scottish game under any circumstance. They wouldn't have Jamie Carragher up for a Scottish game, but that's what they did back then, because they placed a lot higher value on it. And it's interesting, because that's where I was going next, actually, Martin, with my questioning, was all through the book, there's the seeds of what's to come. You can feel it, not on every page, because it's incredibly upbeat a lot of the time, but if you want to see it, it's there. And you know, one of the things that you talk about is when Andy Cole goes to Newcastle for £7 million, when Alan Shearer goes to Andy Cole goes to Manchester United from Newcastle, when Alan Shearer goes to Newcastle for £15 million. All of a sudden, just very quickly, over a very short period, the boosters went on in the English Premier League. And I remember at the time, it was almost, I didn't really get a sense of what was happening in the moment, but it was then suddenly accelerating away. And that idea that Rangers and Manchester United were the two biggest clubs in British football was pretty quickly smashed, even though Rangers were still big and still capable of big things, like obviously bringing Gazza on board. But there was those little seeds quite early, and as you say, that failure to get on the train quickly enough, which, let's face it, is the MO of Scottish football. You can see where things were going.
And it is quickly, Johnny. I mean, 1993 Rangers not outbid Manchester United, but outdo Manchester United that summer in terms of the biggest transfer fee in British football history for Duncan Ferguson. The same month or whatever it was that United played, just a wee bit less than that for Roy Keane. So Rangers fans in that summer, just after the heroics of 92-93, United have just won a title. Absolutely within the rights to think there are two clubs in British football at the moment by some distance, actually. And that perpetuates for some time, and I think fans still cling on to it. But you know, it'd be what the January 95 that United get Cole, and you know, Rangers aren't spending that kind of money in a window. Never mind, it wasn't called a window in those days, but you know what I mean. In a summer, never mind on one player, and obviously the Shearer deal. Just that was new level. I think we could conceive, given that we spent just about 4 on Dunk, that it might be possible to do something in the range of 6 or 7 million. That wasn't in another world. 50 million was by 1996, and it was very quickly. In Sky's words, a whole new ballgame. It really was.
Let's do something that every Rangers fan of a certain vintage has done, which is wallow in 92-93 for a little while, shall we? What, as a fan, Martin, forgetting about all this, what's your most indelible couple of memories from that season as a kid in that maelstrom of incredible matches?
Oh wow! I mean, I'm same as you, Johnny. So very similar kind of experience, I guess. I was 11 when this season started. My first as a season ticket holder, so extra special for me. Just the fact we had been going to games, but now I'm going every week. We're going to away games. My dad and I up to Pittodrie, Parkhead, and Tannadice, wherever. Very regularly, even Easter Road, Johnny. And also to Bruges. That's my first European trip, a day trip, getting the day off school. No idea how my mother wrote that letter, but she did. And it was so exciting. Nisbet's goal, I suppose, it's crazy as it was, this massive off-cutter. And tragic in a way, because he played at Parkhead and the Saturday, got injured, and never played for Rangers again and played football again. His career was over. How quickly things can change in this sport. But this sense around the ground that this is ours, that kind of thing doesn't happen unless your name is on the cup. And that's what people were saying. And when you're an 11 or 12-year-old boy by that point, you accept what your elders tell you. They know best. They've been and watched, been and seen Rangers up and down for how many years. And you get guys in their 50s saying, it's ours, our name's on the cup. We just don't lose in France, don't lose in Marseille, and they'll struggle in Belgium the way we did. We drew 1-1, and it was a hard place to go, and Belgium and France and all that. We'll beat Moscow at home, and we're in the final. I was going to Munich. I'd been promised we're going to that European Cup final. So not a dream, Johnny, not a kind of fantasy, a kind of pie in the sky. Well, you never know. As we said, maybe heading towards Ibrox for the Juventus game or the Ajax game in years to come. Genuine belief that we could be champions of Europe. And it's something my generation, any other Scottish football fans of my generation will not have experienced, and we experienced it that one time, and obviously it didn't transpire, but it was a genuine sense that you're going places. Really, you're going to the promised land, effectively. And then when it didn't happen, Johnny, I suppose that summer treble for the first time in a generation, something that was spoken of and finally kind of delivered. Miles in front. I mean, we're not losing the title. The title's not even a question. There was this, and this was very misguided, a sense that we've knocked that door ajar. Now we're going to burst it open next season. We're going to break the British transfer record, and it's just, how hard is it to go from nearly there to there, Well, we'd find out.
Yeah, really, really difficult to make that transition, but I suppose an incredibly exciting season. Hard to kind of really explain it for those who only look back on it via the pictures, because it's you can't really. It's the experience of it, the living of it. We can't talk about that season, talk about that European run without talking about some of the mythology that's built up around it in terms of what might have happened, how events in Marseille and with Bernard Tapie, who you've already mentioned, might have shaped the outcome of that group. And you talk about it in the book, and just wondered for the guys who might be watching this, how you look upon it, and given that you've really drilled into a lot of the detail of what's been said over the years about what happened in those 6 games. And I suppose the crucial games would be Rangers versus Bruges at Ibrox, where Mark Hateley was sent off, and then probably looking on to the final game between Bruges and Marseille in Bruges, when there was a very early goal in the game. Just looked like it was basically played as if there was no intention of ever scoring another goal. That, now, I don't know if that's mythology, but that's my recollection of that, and the highlights seen that at night.
A bit of it, bit of yes, bit of no. I mean, it's all wrapped up in the fact that, look, it's almost without question that Marseille cheated in that season of Champions League. They cheated in everything else. They had, Tapie had bribed in the past, or attempted to bribe in the past in the European Cup. He would have argued that, well, that's the game, because Marseille, were the victims of a fairly dodgy situation in the European Cup semi-final against Benfica. Or are these the rules? Are they? Well, we can play that game as well. And then a lot of the stuff I managed to get for the book really comes out of James Dixon's brilliant book, The Fix, on that first ever Champions League season and what became of it. James was on my show last year. He's superb wealth of knowledge. including a good contact with the referee of our game in Marseille. So there are a few things that are I think, mythologised. Hateley should have been sent off. That Rangers didn't like at the time. I didn't like it at the time as a supporter. Looking back, he is foolish to raise his hands in that way, given the relatively recent changes to the law, which 5 years ago wouldn't have mattered, but by that point probably did. It's a sending off. Bruges do try in Belgium. To what extent, who knows? The goal is very sloppy and it's very early, and there's just a lot of subjectivity around that, I suppose, and speculation. They almost certainly paid the Siska players to try extremely hard against us, but players should try hard. It's not against the laws to incentivize, playing well and trying hard. The key issue for me, or two key issues for me, we should have won in Belgium and didn't. And if we did, in our own hands, history may have been different. That 1-1 draw, awful in the first half, brilliant in the second, but missed chances, missed big chances. McCoist, Hateley, these stars of the time, missed good chances. 1-0 down in France, Tappy goes into the referee's room to ask him if there's anything he can do. The referee orders him out with his assistant. Well, don't call them assistants then, linesman. And because it's completely inappropriate to be doing that. It's seen by Rangers officials, Rangers subs, Gary McSwiggan being one, but we don't report it. The referee doesn't report it. It might have been in the match report, but UEFA have no interest in doing it. By the way, meantime, Tappy's then in the Marseille dressing room when they're ahead in this crucial game. They win, they're in the final. If Rangers win, we're in the final. A draw rolls it on to the last game. Berating his players, and you're getting sacked. At one stage, that Raymond Goethals nearly says, well, if you want to just pick the team, you can sit in the dugout and I'll just leave, kind of thing. The guy was a megalomaniac, obviously, but a control freak, and this was his absolute burning ambition, and he was going to do whatever it took to kind of get there. Rangers should have reported that, and at least asked the question of UEFA: what on earth was the chairman of a football club doing in the referee's room, asking if there was anything he could do? But we didn't, because we want to be at this head table. Why rock that boat? And we ultimately didn't do our job at Ibrox in the final game, and the rest is a kind of sad history. Marseille get done, of course, really trying to make their life easier in the run up to that final, because they're still going for the French title. By look, if you can go easy on us as a Valenciennes, I think that would be really helpful, because we want to rest some players because we're playing Milan on the Wednesday night or whatever. And that's when it all unravelled, because one of them was not prepared to play that game.
Yeah.
Others were, and they got found out. As James Dixon points out, Milan were involved in their other league match. Of course, they're going to win the title, but they could win the title with a draw. I think at home to Brescia or something like that. And a draw for Brescia would also, whomever it was, would also relegate Fiorentina. No love lost with Milan and Fiorentina. Milan go one up, and they let their opponents walk the ball back into the net. So as James Dixon pointed out, you get two incidents of match fixing effectively either end of the week, and one team one club is in scandal, and the others kind of glorified, because Milan would eventually go on and of course win the following season's European Cup. But it was the reality of European football. But if what if Rangers had at least asked the question of that? It's grated, of course, it's grated on the support for 30 years now. But we didn't really take care of business in Belgium. We didn't have players fit enough for those games. Hateley was careless. He was foolish in that moment. And would we have beaten Milan in that final? Have a look at the Scottish Cup final against Aberdeen when we're holding on those last 25, 30 minutes. But this team in that season going through all sorts of barriers, all sorts of pain barriers, emotional barriers, mental barriers. And Milan was strange that night. Capello kind of set his team out in a kind of weird way. Who knows? But what's interesting, again, to try and drill down, Johnny, try to capture this moment in time. You have Franco Baresi talking seriously that he expects that Rangers will be in the final. And Italy had drawn 0-0 with Scotland, I think, or played Scotland recently. And this will be tough. That's the levels that this team had raised. Now, it was the crest of a wave. We didn't know that at the time. We thought this is what we've been waiting for since Souness arrived, really.
Yeah.
And now we've created this thing, this group stage thing, and with the branding and the marketing and everything else, and this cool music. Right, we're finally here. So yeah, it's easy to write a hagiography, and there are plenty out there if that's your choice. I hope there's a lot of love for this team this season in particular through these pages, but you have to be a historian about it and have to say, well, really, what is the actual picture here? What's the actual truth? And as always, it's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, again, that's a topic I want to touch on. Is a fascinating chapter in there, which I think he absolutely nailed, called Lads. And it's really important because you can't understand the period without understanding the culture that informed it. And the 90s was a strange time. And I think for anyone going back, looking at it, especially some of the culture that came out of the 90s, films, music, compared to today, it's, how would I describe it? Unvarnished, more in your face. And part of that was fueled by a booze, cheap drugs culture. We saw Britpop. There was great elements to it, the Cool Britannia thing. But fundamentally, there was this lads culture that permeated everything, and certainly was intrinsically linked to football, as football became cooler and cooler, leading up to Euro '96 when it was just about the coolest thing that there was anywhere. And I think you absolutely nailed that sense in Lads. And I wanted to talk about that, but I also wanted to talk about something Duncan Ferguson said recently in an interview. I was listening to a podcast with him. I can't remember which one it was. It was an hour and a half. I think he did it with Tony Bellew, actually, the boxer. And he was asking him about his injuries, and Duncan said, "You know, I brought it all on myself, Tony. I absolutely brought it all on myself." He said, "I was actually physically pretty fit, but the amount of boozing I was doing, the amount of late nights, not taking care of my sleep, not looking after 100% what I was eating, I was still a fit boy, but all these things, that's what the injuries came from, 100%." And I thought, wow, I've not heard anyone from that era talk about that. And you know, when I was reading your book, Martyn, injury after injury after injury, the team that drinks together, injury. And I thought to myself, is this lads culture, is this lads chapter, is it basically just saying to me, it felt like it was saying to me, well, here's your injuries right here. And, you know, how big of an impact was it?
Huge. But so there are two elements to that, and we can't lose sight of that. You're absolutely right. Let's say that conditioning was not a huge part of Rangers in the 90s. Now, Souness had his blind spot, I think, with medicine as well, and I don't think he really believed in injuries, really, unless you're broken leg or something like that. You know, a freak kind of physical contact kind of situation, because he didn't have injuries himself as a player, really. He hardly, until he actually came to Rangers, ironically enough. But then he's at the very end of it all. He constant, consistent brilliance for Liverpool and Middlesbrough. So I kind of thought, soon as if you've got niggly injuries, you're weak, really, and that's all there is for it, you know. But he was, of course, big on diet and lifestyle and it's supple training rather than just run up and down sandy hills and all that. But let's say that maybe went out the way a wee bit in the 90s. Rangers players were walking up to Bellhouston Park from Ibrox, popping in to a cafe for some bacon rolls, sugary tea, whatever. There was an Italian film crew doing a documentary, I guess, in that 92-93 season, following them in wonder, aghast, choose your words as you wish, at this kind of practice. Wasn't happening at Milan, wasn't happening at Juventus. Now, perhaps other things were happening at Juventus, but that's kind of by the by. This was not a kind of professional outfit. Arsenal are probably the kind of bedfellow, I suppose, down south, the famous Tuesday Club, and all of that. At United, Ferguson had worked hard to try and rid that culture, because that's what he walked into in 1986 for sure. Cantona was a massive help in that, the same way that Bergkamp and others would eventually be at Arsenal, but that needed Wenger really to kind of get that all into place. So you're absolutely right, Johnny. It was a culture that ultimately was corrosive and counterproductive in terms of the fitness of the squad, but it did build something special, and that is another part of that particular conversation. 92-93, Rangers still had good players, of course they did, but it was an incredible team spirit. Andy Gorham, whatever I forget now, the 4 ligaments in the knee, the one that you could damage but still kind of get away with, that had been damaged, a collision in Belgium. Couldn't train. He played, but he couldn't ever say, look, my knee's about to collapse here, like you would now. You wouldn't have a choice. You just wouldn't be anywhere near it. But didn't want to let him down. Did not want to be away from this period in history, and this momentum and this incredible team spirit. There would be a hiatus, I think it's probably fair to say, from 93 to 95, as this team was literally broken. But in those clutch moments when Celtic came back, those big old firm games, big domestic games, you've got to go away from home and get something, Pittodrie or whatever, this team did, in large parts down to an incredible sense of team spirit, fueled by spirits, of course, but it was a huge X factor in being able to do what they did. There was just a price to pay, and that's the balance of the era. And you know me, Johnny, you read Revolution. It's not just about Rangers and shots and goals and crosses and saves and whatever else. I try to put the Rangers history in the context of the history around it, and that's the same here. But that lads' culture really is the 1990s. The 1980s was very earnest. It was deeply divided, east and west, left and right kind of conversation. And then that ended. The Berlin Wall fell down. New Labour was a result of those arguments being lost, really, or won and lost, depending on your point of view. And then after 2001, we're back to being incredibly earnest and whatever else. The 1990s, there was nothing earnest about it. It was just fun. There was just nothing to worry about, apparently, unless you lived in the Balkans or Rwanda. They might feel compelled to disagree with that, but certainly in the West, it was more and more money in the hip pocket. British culture producing things that young people were genuinely proud of and into. And all the kind of political, serious conversations that were over, they were done. Those debates had been completed. I've borrowed from Seinfeld, it was a decade about nothing. And there's not a lot wrong with that, given what happened before and certainly maybe what happened after. So to grow up in that environment was a lot of fun. These fans, Rangers fans, had the best of times here. But if you're a good-looking Rangers player with a lot of money in your hip pocket as well, a lot more money than the punters coming to see you, and you're mixing with pop stars and rock stars and movie stars, you are the new pop star. And it wasn't that long ago that being a football fan was something someone would mutter under their breath if they were at a dinner party. They would be afraid to admit it. But you're absolutely right. It was all cool now. And England top was designed because of how it looked with jeans. Because people would kind of wear that to the pub to watch games, and it became part of a kind of wider culture and a hell of a lot of fun, hedonistic fun, complacent fun, and that's complacent fun is pretty much how I would describe Rangers in the 1990s, because it was an uproarious amount of enjoyment, but seed sowing for what came next.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the guy who literally probably provided the spark of football becoming what it was, Paul Gascoigne in the 1990 World Cup, capturing a nation's heart, playing with such reckless abandon in a good way, creative quality that you just weren't used to seeing from a British player, the ability to glide past a man, to play the pass that no one saw. You know, this was a guy who, at that point, at his very best, and listen, we saw Paul Gascoigne incredibly good, but he wasn't what he was then prior to the injury, I don't think. It's interesting that he was the spark that started it all and then turned up at Ibrox, obviously, when he did, and almost reignited it all again. And I think you capture that brilliantly in your chapter on Gascoigne. And I wanted to ask you about this element that you talked about earlier about not doing a hagiography. Gazza is a complex character, a much loved character. How difficult is it to approach a character like this in history who you know will inspire real loyalty from a lot of people, but also go into some of the chapters that you do in the book so well? I think you handle it so well, and tell the unvarnished truth about not only what happened but how it was perceived at the time, and how kind of, I think, that'll be quite shocking for people who weren't there. The difference between how it was handled then and how it be handled now.
Well, that was my interest. I mean, how difficult it is. It can be. I'm asked this a lot. I probably have bigger Rangers heroes, maybe, but he is, in my opinion, the best footballer who has played for Rangers. I mean, better professionals, the guys who gave us more. Laudrup, of course, gave us more over the course of his time. But in terms of natural talent, the kind of thing that gets me off my seat, the kind of thing. Laudrup didn't change the weather. Laudrup here, and he looked beautiful and he looked brilliant and he was sensational. Rangers were still kind of average, 94, 95. Gascoigne changed the picture and he changed Rangers, and Smith changed his team around him, which had consequences elsewhere that were positive for Rangers. And then, 2 years of really, really strong football domestically anyway. So I loved him as a 14, 15, 16-year-old at that time. No question at all. It wasn't that difficult to tell the truth because he's told it that, all, if not all the details, most of the detail was taken from his autobiographies, and he's been very, very candid about what happened in Gleneagles that night with Cheryl, what had happened before. So it's out there. He's told that story. So I guess my interest in that chapter called Heroes was about how we respond to that at the time and now, years later, now within cancel culture as we would know it, and dealing with those heroes from the past, Gascoigne, John Lennon, Sean Connery, Miles Davis, all similar issues with domestic violence, all with genius, but with a dark side to their character. Music and art is full of it, absolutely full of these kind of characters in different ways, of course, and that makes for, I think, a fascinating conversation about the moral judgments we make on people that we don't know, for a start, and can we separate this endless age-old question? Can you separate the art from the artist? Well, you only consume the art. You're not inviting them in for dinner. You're not inviting them to babysit. You consume what they've produced, and this is I guess the delusion of fame. Really, we think we're sitting beside. We think we know these people, and they know us, more importantly, and they absolutely don't. So that's always been a fascination for me, and I don't think the adulation, and it was from that summer, Johnny, that in Italy in 1990, really, right up until when he came here, and I was at his unveiling in the blistering hot July sunshine, With
Did
all
you
these
have the
kids.
blonde hairdo, Martyn?
I doubt my mother might have let me go to Bruges for a day of school. Would not. I had a. It was maybe I should have enjoyed it maybe more at the time. I think I had a number 2 all over or something like that. But I didn't quite go to the bleach side of it. But it was adulation. It was hero worship. And in a way, he loved that. He needed to be loved. He needed to be wanted throughout his career. He's needed that, but it's not healthy. You and I are fairly kind of level-headed people. How on earth would we deal with that kind of adulation, that kind of fame, that kind of pressure that brings? He couldn't. And there was Paul Gascoigne and there was Gazza, and those were 2 very different personalities. And the extent to which we absolutely worship people is something that I've tried to reflect on in that chapter, and maybe it isn't healthy. And there's always a frail human being there, always, and these are our dreams projected onto them, and they better be mentally stable enough to deal with those dreams. I think footballers, it would appear, are a lot better prepared now. There'll be exceptions, of course. We might complain that they don't give as much, and do they lack personality, and it's football a bit soulless because of that. Well, maybe they need shut out from the real mental cases, which are us. All these projections onto strangers that we have all this emotional investment onto strangers that we're prone to deliver. But yeah, that dynamic was a fascinating one for me, always has, and it was interesting to do that. Challenging, of course, because this guy's presented me with so many of my greatest Rangers memories. I will be on stage with him in the heart of London's glittering West End in the springtime. But there's another part of that. There's another part of that story, and I think as long as we recognise that, then that's important. How fans did at the time, and Mark Dingwall immediately wanted him sacked.
I thought that was remarkable. That was it was brave, and it reflects well on Mark, actually, that he wrote that when he did, and it really did surprise me, because it's not my recollection of how that was perceived. You kind of touch on it. I know you looked back on the media at the time, and obviously I'm being a media guy, I'm very interested in how the media responded to certain events. You talk about it, how some columnists sort of seem to be more perturbed that he got sent off for his kick out at Winston Bogarde than actually what happened at Glen Eagles. And here you had this fan media guy, who's probably often perceived in a certain way in my industry, came out extremely quickly.
Yeah. And it was extremely quickly, because that issue was ready to go, and this obviously happened or it came out the day after Ajax, which I think was the Wednesday, I imagine, and we're playing Aberdeen, I think, on the Saturday home, and the vast majority of this chapter is about Rangers' terrible start in the Champions League and complaints about that, and absolutely no time for the normal contributors to digest the Gascoigne story. But Mark basically got an editorial out there just before it went to press. Ibrox is no place for us, no home for a wife beater. And there were others in later editions who, again, wanted them sacked. How can I cheer this man? What signal, what message does that send? And there were others who, as football fans are, Johnny, very tribal and loyal, and cannot possibly agree with the commentariat who were filling their boots because they were perceived as hating Rangers, and in many cases were absolutely correct to do so. And there's quite a lot of let's say unreconstructed male views about what happened, but the majority shrugged, cheered, rattled in a free kick from the edge of the box that day. Not a lot of people sitting on their hands, because he's a commodity, and he delivered, and Rangers were going for 9 in a row. And I mean, what was more interesting was how Rangers responded to that. We're not speaking on about someone's private life. Paul wants to come to us for advice, counselling. We'll be here, but basically, he's paid to do a job. unthinkable now.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, we could talk a little bit more about Brian Laudrup and what he offered, and it's self-evident. But I won't go into that just now because I think the Gascoigne one's slightly more interesting because of there's a little bit more shades of grey there to kind of to go into. But one element of the book which I think is really interesting is this idea of the Cavaliers and the roundheads, and this chapter is focused on the mythology that built up of Celtic being these buccaneering, free-spirited football poets who were knocking the ball about like Brazil 1970, while this rudimentary, functional Rangers side with Brian Laudrup and Paul Gascoigne were churning their way through title after title, just by sheer chance, by sheer happenstance, going to Celtic Park and getting battered and then winning game after game. But it's interesting because at the time you do remember, you do recall the sort of the spirit of how these games and how these results were perceived, and there's no doubt there was the odd game where Celtic played well and Tommy Burns' side definitely played decent football, but there was a bit more to it than I think people gave it credit for at the time.
Yeah, I mean, this narrative it certainly wasn't born in the 90s. It goes kind of way back. It probably feeds into these caricatures of Presbyterian Calvinists and more demonstrative and dramatic Roman Catholics. So that's all part of the spiel and part of the pantomime, I guess. It just reached its apotheosis, I think, for me, and it was a lot of, I guess, Burns' old teammates in positions of punditry in the radio, television, newspaper columns that were extolling that. Again, nothing new there. Aberdeen used to have it in the late 80s when the Soonest Revolution was kind of up. But yeah, but Aberdeen best footballing team. As if there's points for style against the real thing. And it was a bit of a nonsense. Rangers scored more goals than Celtic. Rangers conceded more goals than Celtic that season. And so many of that Celtic team's results were draws or wins that were of one goal, a margin of one goal. So it didn't quite fit, but it's just that notion, and you'll be you'll know it more than me, the seduction of just large, broad brush strokes, Johnny, in terms of painting these pictures, because it's quick and it's easy, it sells. There's dog whistles there. There's things that just ring a few bells and get people raging or get people absolutely on board or whatever it may be, and it meant that Rangers team, certainly the one in 95-96, which I think Smith's technically best Rangers team by actually some distance, doesn't get anyone near the credit that it deserves. It had treaded water between 93 and 95 because it could. They were broken for a start, all these injuries we spoke about, but there was no challenger. Rangers didn't need to do anything. We drew. We didn't win half the games, I think, 93, 94, and still won comfortably. But inconceivable now that could possibly happen. But 95-96 Rangers were, I think, genuinely superb in places. The Laudrup Cup final, of course, being the perfect example of that. But there are plenty more. It's just Gascoigne himself. We'd remember more of his goals that season if he didn't better it sometimes in the same game. Never mind, the kind of following week. But so I wanted to touch on that and the wider. We get it in sport all the time. Stephen Hendry, Jimmy White, West Germany, Netherlands from the 70s. There's this need in some that the actual bare facts of results, that can't be all there is. There needs to be more, which of course there is more. It's part of the story, but it's just where you can evaluate it. And where I thought it maybe reached its end was a Champions League semi-final when Mourinho was back at Chelsea and they played Atletico Madrid in Madrid, semi-final, first leg. a shock to no one that teams managed by Mourinho and Simeone were not going to be going at it hammer and tong, and the game's over before the second leg kind of thing, and it was 0-0, and it was not an aesthetic classic. And I just remember the night I also had to go back to just check I wasn't imagining it for the book, but lots of random football fans on Twitter that night saying they owe us basically for me watching that. This is you put you to sleep, blah blah blah. Now it's absolutely okay to say that game. You see that game last night? Oh, it was dreadful. It was dreadfully dull. But I saw through that a sense of entitlement. And I write in the book, as if you've gone to see Hamilton and found out that someone's forgotten how to rap, that this is a television show you're watching. This is a reality show that you're watching, and you're not impressed by the fact that it's not end-to-end and it's not 4-3. Ask Chelsea or Atletico fans how relaxed and dull and bold they were that night. They would have been on a razor's edge because something could happen that changes the whole dynamic of that game. We've all sat through that in European competitions. That's sport. It's the contents. It's the consequences. It's the jeopardy that make your heart almost burst through your chest. And this sense that no, I should be seeing 3-2. I've paid for this. I've paid a subscription for this. It needs to look good rather than just be about the contest itself. So that was an interesting story. And again, parallels in England that season with Newcastle United, with fans in Vox Pops outside St James's Park saying, I'd rather lose 4-3 than win 1-0. Well, Manchester United won 1-0 and they went on to win the league with a few other 1-0s. And there was a nice parallel that particular season.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. That was the best Walter Smith side. And interestingly, just reading the chapter on the 9 in a row season, the season that obviously followed that, I forgot how many injuries there were. I forgot how decimated the team was. How they hadn't really added the way they could have, perhaps. And ultimately, it was close. It was quite close, wasn't it? It's closer than probably Rangers would have wanted, and certainly should have been, given the gap that there was between the clubs at that point. I forgot how tense the season was. You read back and you obviously remember the individual games, and there was a couple of good games amongst the Old Firm games. But as you described so accurately in the book, the kind of most memorable one from the point of view of how important it was, the game at Parkhead, the 1-0 game with Brian Laudrup getting his toe on Ian Durrant's kind of lob, was horrible. A horrible game to watch in every way, shape or form, but the importance of it just washed everything away, and ultimately that season was just about getting over the line, as everyone from Walter Smith to Richard Gough to Alan McCoist has said in the past. I don't know if you look upon that back across that season and have the same kind of vivid memories outside of the key moments. Obviously that you don't forget the Charlie Miller cross and the Laudrup header, but perhaps the rest of it was maybe more of a grind than it certainly had been the previous season, where there was some champion football on display.
Yeah, it was less pleasing than the season before. My memory was, and I was glad that looking back at the fanzines, it burns through those editions, the claustrophobia, the absolute unbearable tension on a week-by-week basis, which 95, 96, the 8th had a little bit of, absolutely. But we hadn't really been used to that. Even back in those early Soonest titles, there were more than Aberdeen involved in that. But this season of destiny, where it felt like 10 years was coming to this moment, 10 years work, or a decade's work. And it really was tough to endure. That said, the first 2 Old Firm games were genuinely brilliant football games. We speak, I think, on the anniversary of the one at Parkhead in November '96, which is probably one of the best football matches I've ever been at. That's when Andy Gray says, "I'm speechless," but it basically said, "Martyn, carry on." I'm absolutely speechless. I can't.
Yeah.
I just can't describe what's happening here. Where Sky couldn't show an incident for about 2 or 3 minutes because the game didn't stop. It was an incredible game. The 3-1 in New Year had moments. Two very tired teams. I don't think they were particularly well with flu and injuries, whatever else. But as time went on, Rangers had a comfortable lead, especially after that night at New Year. It's done. And then all of a sudden it wasn't done. And then all of a sudden we have more players at the football club injured than fit. And all of a sudden a Mark Hateley, who I think Hugh Keevans in a rare moment of linguistic brilliance called them more memorabilia than mobile, is brought back. And you think, my goodness, we've really gone back to the future here. And Celtic had also beaten Rangers in the Scottish Cup just 10 days before that. And it really came down to the utter fundamentals of sport. I've described this before, but that Arcadian ball game where you're pushing a ball from one end of the island or one end of the town, sorry, to the other. It's rudimentary. Like that game at Parkhead is an abomination. But we stood tall, we won, and that's ultimately what it became about. But you're right about the injuries. You're right about the lack of squad planning, I suppose. If that 9-10 thing is not hanging over, the summer of '96 probably looks a lot more ruthless. And a lot of, right, we were good last season. These players are staying. You were good last season, but that's probably your last, actually. You're probably at the end of what you can kind of really do. And a normal kind of environment, I think a team does a lot more surgery that particular summer than it did. But I think Smith was loath, even when they did loads of surgery the year before, year after. It was bringing a lot in. A lot of those old timers were kept on because they've done it before, and it's 9-10. It was like a tractor beam from 1992 that led to history, but it led to some short-termism at a time where football was not being short-termist at all.
Yeah, and I suppose one of these themes you come back to quite well, at least once or twice in the book, is that memorable title win over Aberdeen for 3 in a row, and whether or not, if that had gone the other way, it might have actually been better for Rangers at that period in terms of their European performance, because the suffocation that took place psychologically on these players to get to that 9 and to hit that 9. Obviously, no. Listen, unless you're talking about a European Cup win, you're not swapping, are you? But it's something that you wrestle with, isn't it, in the book and touch on.
Well, no one at the end of that season, that 1991 season, was talking about 9 in a row. It was still thought of as something we'll never see again. Rangers wouldn't have gone into free fall. Rangers were still the strongest club. Rangers would still have won the majority of the titles in the 1990s. But possibly for the longer term good, better infrastructure, more investment in other places, a more gradual building or recognition that maybe this guy isn't cut out to managers in Europe. Do we need to make a change here? All of these kind of things that I don't think Rangers could make. Decisions that I don't think Rangers could make, because by 1992, which is where I start this book, and someone, which is just a year after, of course, that 91-92 thing, 1981, sorry. Someone writes to Fall saying, all of a sudden, in the space of a year, Celtic are gone. Aberdeen are now are gone. Hearts put up a fight for a little bit until February. But we've won the league comfortably. We've scored 100 goals, or over 100 goals, record points total. Who's stopping us? And this guy says, well, Sparta Prague's a disappointment. Europe continues to be a disappointment, but I'm consoled by the fact that we're so far ahead domestically. Roll on 10 in a row. And that being dangled, especially after 5, especially after 92-93 in that treble, you start to see it in the press. Can Rangers do this? That then becomes the thing. Yeah. Coupled with the 3 formers, Rangers are pulled towards settling this old score. A score that was reached when, half the first division was part-time? Are we really talking about the same kind of thing? Well, that's how rivalry works, Johnny. That number's there. it has to be kind of met. But you can't escape, I think the truth, which is the Rangers became blinkered just at a time where football was absolutely not. And Rangers were going back to settle scores from the past, just as football was looking to the future. And that's why I called the book what I called it. It was a forward-looking thing. Go and match this, go and better this, go and try and make history. But I think there's a turn inward, looking to the past when we just created the future. We'd literally just created the future in the case of the Champions League. And that dilemma, that dichotomy, that friction, I hope runs through the pages of this book, that we were having, as I said, a hell of a lot of fun as Rangers fans. Same amount of titles and trophies as in the first book, by the way. Same amount of silverware at this halfway point. But a growing, gnawing realization, frustration that there's a bigger party going on elsewhere. Why are those players fitter than ours? Why do they keep the ball better than ours? Why is now we're seeing all these leagues on television every single week? Why don't we look as good as this? Football's getting away from us. We'd always be pulled in because, well, there's Brian Laudrup won a game against Celtic. There's Paul Gascoigne won a title pretty much on his own in a sunny afternoon against Aberdeen. We're always pulled in back into this narrative because we want it. Those 4 Old Firm games in 96, 97, breathless stuff. But you can have both, right? And you can enjoy those nights out after those big wins, as the players did, while still thinking, are we where we should be? Are we where we thought we would be in the summer of 1992, by 1997, when France football is calling us the stupidest club in Europe? And that's the constant tension throughout the book.
Yeah, and obviously, in terms of the final chapter from a sporting point of view, is one of the most fascinating seasons probably in Rangers history, and one of the most painful and catastrophic. And I think there's again, we talk about these myths that have built up, and it's quite interesting how many different facets you put into what you feel is the answer to the puzzle that is that season, why it happened the way it did. Because if you look back and listen, we were all reading so much of the media and the information that was at the time, and few of us who were around can forget that Daily Record spread. Kudos to whoever wrote that, because I think it was probably Jim Traynor, to be honest, where Rangers had 3 teams that could win the Premier League. And I always remember, looking at it and actually feeling quite convinced by it, looking at it, because Rangers had put so much money in the summer and brought in so many players. You thought, well, look, they've completely strengthened. I for one, did not see what was coming. Perhaps I should have.
And this is why history is important, because I didn't. No chance. Look at these players from Serie A in 1997. 5 of them, 6, if you include the Reno and his wee pal. And no chance. Look at this Amoruso guy. And then when the striker starts, you think, right, well, finally, Smith's been trying to replace McCoy for a couple of seasons now. We've done it. This guy is a sensation. But that's, again, as I said, why history is important, because we should have seen, as those tired, unfit players with a captain who had to pick that trophy up in his suit because he's flying away to America, and a lot of these guys are still there, and a lot of these practices are still there in terms of the professionalism and everything else. And hubris is something that's been, Rangers fans use it ironically, don't they? A lot of the time. I think it's only now, in that summer of 97, that the hubris actually impacts. A lot of confidence, for sure, and Souness's arrogance and Gascoigne, Laudrup's arrogance at times on the ball. But Rangers, as part of their friendly preparations, played a game against themselves with a huge Champions League qualifier against a team from Scandinavia halfway through the season, etc., on the horizon. And you're absolutely right. the record. Here's 3 Rangers teams that can win the title. I call that season a house with 1,000 sliding doors, because there are so many moments that fans go back to. Negri's squash injury, of course. Gascoigne's sending off and that kind of spiral that he went on. Alan Stubbs not being sent off despite just being booked and tackling Marco Negri at waist height on the touchline in that game in November where Rangers 1-0 up. And he would, of course, would not get a second booking and would go and header in the equaliser. That I think if Celtic lose that night, for example, I cannot see how they get back. Diana, Princess of Wales, that crash, Rangers were due to go to Parkhead on the Monday night of that weekend in a far better place than Celtic, shall we say, and it gets punted to the November. There are more. Amoruso's botched injury. Inconceivable that Rangers look as much of a shambles as they did with him there for the majority of the season, and yet there's a sense that if it wasn't that, it'd have been something else. That the discipline in the club was non-existent. That Smith tried to do so much that summer in one go, and it's really hard to get right. Really hard to get right. Laudrup, did he really want to be there? Well, he did. He wanted to join Ajax that summer. A lesson there always that if a player wishes to go, get the deal that's right for the club and get it done and move on. All of these things, and it wasn't about Walter going, by the way, because Walter, we knew Walter was going in 2011.
Yeah,
and yet this Rangers team powered through to win a cup in a league for him. But it was a Rangers team, all things being equal, that would have stayed for a few years after Walter had left in 2011. They were in their 20s. How many players over 30 had been through so much and were going at the same time? And this sense of an ending for months from Walter saying that, but yet you know that Laudrup won't be there. And you know that so many of these heroes will not be there. And then Gascoigne disappears, and it's just a continual sense that this is concluding. And even then, Johnny, Rangers probably still should have done it after winning that final Old Firm game. This was not a Celtic team that knew how to win a title. Why would they? They didn't have experience of winning league championships. They didn't win anything for years. But they hung about, and Rangers faltered first, effectively. And that run-in is a shambles.
I spoke privately at one point, Martin, to a Celtic player who was part of that squad, and he openly admitted Rangers had a better team.
Of course,
openly admitted it.
Well, the head-to-head
said, we shouldn't have won. I shouldn't have that league medal.
No. But that's what I mean. In normal circumstances, probably the summer of '96, a lot of that work gets done in installments. And you can say to players who have run their race, thank you for your time. You've been an incredible servant to the club. You're not the player you were 3, 5, 6 years ago in some cases. Thank you for your time. But he couldn't, because they're his boys. And it would have been the most, inches away from the most romantic end that Rangers fans bought into all the way through the season. Really, as soon as it was clear it was going to end in farewells. What a farewell it will be. A league and cup double for the greatest Rangers manager in the modern era, the greatest Rangers players, the greatest Rangers team, an era that has been the best of times. And we've beaten Celtic twice in the space of a week or whatever it was, the Scottish Cup in the league game, top of the table, and a cup final against Hearts. I mean, Hearts who have just scalped not that long before. And people just kept buying into destiny. Whereas the facts were staring us right in the face that this was a shambles. When Advocat gets announced, the word that gets used time and again, discipline. And fans love it. Fans are, I can't wait till he's there. We'll wait until, June for that discipline to start. Let's not, let's not be hasty and get some discipline now, because this has worked. This guy has worked. These players have worked and beating Celtic and being champions. We'll wait until this guy comes in, because you can't do that in Europe. We know that. But it was a thing that was just tired. It was tired. And the new guys were not coming into a a fit and running machine. Rangers have spent big for ages, Johnny. Of course, it's a hallmark of this era. But the new guys, the new players were brought into a kind of fitter and winning machine and a mentality that was really quite strong. And when all that fell to pieces, they were then the ones left with trying to take that on. They just weren't ready. They hadn't kind of served their time getting used to this club. And Stuart McCall's book, of all the pretty dreadful football autobiographies I've had to read through the preparation, really, really honest and open account, really, really good. Because he said from the start, didn't feel this, did not feel this. Strangers rather than Rangers was the thing that kind of kept being said, and they've not gelled. Too many at one time. And yeah, I mean, it would have been perfect, but I still think maybe fitting, looking back, that it wasn't a fairy tale. And there's McCoy scores the first goal of Souness's first competitive, the first league game, first competitive game of this whole era in 86, 87, and he scores the final, and he should have had another in that final. It can't be a fairy tale.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I feel like in the whole book, Martyn, and I'm talking about the two books when I say the whole book, because I know it was initially conceived as one volume. But the first book, there's almost a sense of wonder at what was achieved. And of course, there's what ifs, but especially around Europe, especially that chance in the 1987-88 season where Europe was like a flower that opened up, and if they'd got past Bucharest, then the potential was there to go and win that trophy. And I think you illustrate that really well. But I think in this chapter, Martyn, and I don't know if this is just your personality coming through, or I don't think it is. I just think it's the demands of Rangers. I think what comes through is the missed opportunity, even in this incredible run of success. This demand for more, this insatiable thing that's at the heart of the club, the DNA of the club, and it comes across. You talk about Mario Jardel, and if that deal had come off, if Emmanuel Petit, if that deal had come off. In the first book, Martyn, I didn't feel like there was so many of those, those moments that could have changed history, because everything almost kind of fell into place to an extent. And I feel like looking through this, there's more of a sense of that maybe this could have been even bigger and even better and even more long lasting.
No, I think that's fair. I think Revolution is, by the nature of the title, forward moving, and from a pretty disastrous position, let's be honest, in that end of that 85-86 season, scrambling with Dundee to be fifth in order to qualify for Europe. I mean, that's in the final day. That's where we are, right? So this sense of the world is open and the sky's the limit, and we are making weather. And 87-88 is a perfect example, but that was disappointing. There will be another. We're set up to win the European Cup. And there is this push forward of belief. I guess, especially after 93, the 92-93 does not lend itself to just that little extra margin that I talked about earlier, because you have Lefsky punting us out in the first round immediately. You have Ike Athens doing similarly. And then two qualifications for the Champions League that follow are humiliating. So I guess it's a kind of, well, what happened to that destiny that we felt was ours? What happened to that trajectory that we felt we were on and genuinely felt we were on? And 92-93 is the absolute living embodiment of that. This is where we were supposed to go. This is where Souness Revolution was supposed to bring us. And so that's normal. When that starts to become apparent, really by 94 after Athens, that's not going to take shape, and is this guy Walt Smith, equipped to manage in Europe? Are we so hamstrung by the three forwards role it wouldn't matter if we had Fabio Capello there, because we need 7, 8, 9 technical players, not just Brian and Paul? Well, this sense again that the promises or the what we expected, these great expectations in that first book, that first 6 years, the realization that those aren't coming to fruition, and a real frustration with that. And I think it's perfectly normal, and I think fans are able to hold those two thoughts in their head at once. Enjoying the success, absolutely, especially when it got tight. Actually, when Celtic came back and Rangers really had to fight for cups and titles and big old firm wins. But football's different. You see it every Sunday, Johnny. You see it every Sunday. Premier League's on, Serie A's on, and this is increasingly a different sport. But we were supposed to be part of that, and that, as I said, that's a tension that kind of runs. And the anger. I keep going back to follow. It's just such a treasure trove of rich detail for contemporaneous history. These are how fans are feeling. There's about 82, 83 issues or whatever from when it first came out in August 88 until the end of my time here in May 98. And there are about 2 issues where there are no moans about the club, and that is 92, 93. Well, there's a genuine feeling, that we're going to the places we're going to go, but these boys, they're ours. They're fans. They know the words. They know what the club means. And they're going to take us to the Holy Grail. And that's it. It's an interesting, the Juventus doubleheader. There's an editorial after the game in Turin where Mark, and I think one other, are actually quite phlegmatic, quite prosaic about the situation. Look, we had players missing, no Laudrup, no Gascoigne that night, a makeshift team. Juventus will do that to teams that are a fantastic club. They will probably win the Champions League, and they did. 4-1. A few weeks later, when the same kind of scoreline hits us at Ibrox, there's the place is on fire. It's a disgrace, it's humiliation, it's we want our own think tank on Scottish football. And things just quickly go. Walter Smith, after the 94 Cup final, the famous Dave McPherson, Ali Maxwell disaster, pilloried, Rangers players pilloried, Smith pilloried. They'd won 7 trophies in a row. Success breeds expectation, and that it's the great expectations, Johnny. I think were the weight around the party, I suppose, during the 90s.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, Martyn, we're going to call it a day there. You've given me an hour and 20, which is more than enough, I think, of your time. But you've done a brilliant job in illustrating what this book's all about, and I hope people are, if they've not already bought it, they're seriously considering parting with some hard-earned cash, because I think, as I said at the start, it will go down really, really well for any teddy bear in your life who might want a gift. And if you want a really good read for yourself, there's no better place. I know for a fact, because I have a young man working for me called Mr. Joshua Barry, who didn't live through any of this, who is flicking through pages wild-eyed at what went on. Because there's stuff that he just, you wouldn't know. The whole Mario Jardel thing, which I didn't know. I didn't know the detail of that, because I remember having a Twitter discussion with you about it, because I kind of fell for the legend that he was couldn't trap a bag of cement in training, and then it was nixed. But obviously you go into the detail, and there's lots of little stories like this all the way through it that I think, especially if you're a younger fan, if you're in your 20s, it's remarkable to go through and get all that detail and all that context, not just of what happened, but of the times that informed what happened. And that's where I think you've made a great success. So final question on it. I think this is an important question to ask, Martyn. I know you're about to be a dad and you've got your eyes on other things for the time being, but is there a wee thought in there of one last idea, one kernel, one little element of Rangers history you'd like to go back?
Well, there are always ideas, but it's the knowledge that I've had the last few years, and that's 3 books now in, I don't know, 4 years that I've managed to put together. Now, I didn't think that would ever happen. It's been a bit of a dream come true. I've always wanted to do it, and it's been a lot of fun, a lot of hard work, and whatever else. But I don't know. I've got other things to focus on for the time being. I will still write. I'm pretty sure of that. But another book, well, we'll need to wait. We'll need to wait and see. but this was my era, and it's best part of 250,000 words on that era. Ibrox, Scottish football itself, Britain, Scotland as a nation, and I think I've said everything I want to say on it. Whether there's one in 98 to 2012, I don't know. It could be a slightly different angle, shall we say. But I'm sure I'll be back at some point with something, because it's a bit of an addiction, to be honest, once you start typing away, as you know. And yeah, Josh texts me now and again to say, oh, this is great, this is really fascinating to know. And I do sometimes feel sorry for those guys who didn't live what we lived through, but they do have the hair and the looks and the fast metabolism. So my sympathy kind of runs out eventually.
Exactly. Don't feel sorry for them. Don't ever feel sorry for them. They've got it easy compared to what we had. We had to come into work hungover, Martyn. You know, it was hard going back then in the 90s. It was burning the candle.
So many trophies to celebrate. It was a tough shift, but I am lucky. I've said this before, and I'm sorry to kind of bang this on, but we are so fortunate to be born when we were born. You know, I was behind the wheel of a car before I knew what a season without Rangers winning a trophy felt like. That's a perfect kind of window when you're a kid, when you're an adolescent, when this really is the be all and end all at some points of your life, because you have no perspective, you've no exams and careers and mortgages, kids, sex, drugs, rock and roll. That's all kind of way ahead. You're eating, sleeping, breathing Rangers, and there was no better time to do it, even though there were bumps and grumps and moans around it. That's part of the story too. But it was the best of times.
Absolutely, and you've captured it superbly, Martyn. Thanks so much for joining me. And listen, as I said before at the start of this conversation, anyone who wants to get the book, there is a link down below in the description that will take you directly to Heart and Hand's website, where you can get not just this new book, but the previous book as well. If you want it signed by Martyn, you can get that done. Listen, guys, thank you very, very much for joining us. It's been a fascinating chat. Really enjoyed it. Thanks to Martyn for coming along, and we will catch up with you on the morning brief next time we're on. Thanks, guys.